Let's start with Derek Chauvin's guilty verdict and whether or not we are surprised. I, for one, was not expecting it to go down this way, but I want to start with you, Olivia. Were you surprised?
I was. As someone who has a lot of libertarian leanings, I don't have a lot of faith in the criminal justice system. I do think that what he did was wrong. He needed to be held accountable. But on the other side of the issue, I do feel like there may have been some outside influence with certain politicians and commentators such as Maxine Waters. Somewhat encouraging the riots if they didn't get the verdict they wanted, which they ended up getting. But I feel like it's possible that the jurors may have been pressured, under the threat of possible riots, as we've seen.
There's no doubt the juries feel that kind of pressure.
Yeah, my take is that there's definitely kind of a dark cloud hanging over the verdict, right? It was done in a way with so much pressure, so much national attention. If I was a juror, I'd be scared that if I don't go the way that some people want me to, my neighborhood will be looted and rioted the next day. But that said, I think he clearly was guilty of at least manslaughter. And I think that the second and third degree murder charges, because in Minnesota they don't actually require intent, no one really believes he intended to kill George Floyd, but he did act with reckless disregard for human life, I think. So I'm glad to see that he was held accountable for this. And while I think there is that cloud, ultimately, to me, this is a sign that the system worked.
So I am a little bit irked at some of the conservative news bubble narrative over whether or not this was a fair trial. It seems like everybody on each side of the debate, no matter what happens, they get something to report on that is unjust and that the justice system is irrelevant and doesn't have any credibility. I mean, Fox News, Newsmax, all those people, like the next day they're going, justice doesn't exist anymore. Any jury can be pressured by social media to do whatever they want. The mob wins. But they wouldn't have been doing that if it had gone the other way. I don't know what we're supposed to think here because it seems like everybody's just making money off it no matter what.
I don't have a lot of faith in the system. I think a big part of why the verdict was, why he was found guilty was because of outside influence. And there are a lot of cases where the police weren't held accountable. I mean, I'm from Montgomery County, Maryland. That was where the infamous Duncan Lemp shooting took place last year, within 24 hours of Breonna Taylor's killing, two unjust killings. And the police are still not held accountable today, as he was killed in his bed sleeping, similar to how Breonna Taylor was killed. So I really, I don't trust them at all. And that's not to say I'm coming at it from a leftist point of view. I'm not with BLM. I don't think it's necessarily a black or white issue or a race issue because Duncan Lemp was a white man. I feel like we should not look at this through that, partisan lens.
There is a problem. I think most people, most Americans across the political spectrum agree we have a problem with policing and abuse of force. That's the main problem, and there's a racial element to it. But it's not just a question of race. It's a question of over-criminalization and over-policing, in my view. We have thousands of laws that are enforced that shouldn't exist. Some of the victims of police brutality were the only reason the police encounter was initiated because they were selling counterfeit cigarettes or passing off fake $20 bills.
That's George Floyd, right?
Right.
The counterfeit bill.
But so I guess I do feel, I sense this frustration, and I agree with it, that to some extent these trials, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. If he gets off, well, it's just a sign that the system is rigged against accountability. It's a white supremacist system, time to riot in the streets. If he's held guilty, it's a sign of a rigged jury, too much social media pressure, it's mob justice. So how do you look at kind of these activists and how they approach this issue? Because maybe I'm a cynic, but I increasingly feel like BLM, Democrat politicians, even far-right radio hosts, they don't want this issue to be solved. They don't want real progress because it's so successful for them to beat the drum on it.
They definitely want to instigate it, people on both sides. And certainly with Black Lives Matter, the organization, I used to be one of those people that, would say BLM, would say hashtag Black Lives Matter. But now that I look closely at the organization, I realize that they have a lot of grifters. I mean, lawyers like Benjamin Crump or Reverend Al Sharpton, or even the co-founder of BLM, Patrisse Cullors, who is a self-proclaimed trained Marxist but owns 4 multi-million-dollar homes. One of them, the most recent one, is in Malibu. I feel like there's probably not a lot of Black people who are facing police brutality in Malibu. It's probably not a big issue there. I don't think she's really with the people at all.
It really pays to consolidate the means of production.
Oh, for sure.
Right. All of this stuff is to some extent an outrage industry. Yeah. And that's why I feel a bit discouraged by the way it's covered on both sides.
Well, let's talk a little bit about sentencing, because that's going to be what happens next, is whether or not he gets a satisfactory sentence Derek Chauvin in the death of George Floyd, which will also lead to more protests. I mean, if he gets just, a couple of years, right? There's going to be protests. There are going to be people smashing windows because it's not enough. He took a life. Do you have any opinions on what is an appropriate sentence for this stuff? Because this is where justice just gets to be completely subjective. How many years do you attach to voluntary manslaughter?
Yeah, I think ideally, I agree. Nothing is going to really please everyone. If it's a shorter sentence, some people will be critical of it. If it's a really long sentence, they'll be critical of it. Something in the middle, right? I don't know if that's 10 years. I don't know if that's 15 years, 12 years. But there's got to be serious accountability when you show reckless disregard for an American's life. But at the same time, we shouldn't be locking people up forever and throwing away the key, no matter how outraged the national discourse is over something, when it was not first-degree murder. There are shades and degrees here that matter.
Correct. I think that the range that you presented, 10 to 15 years, that sounds reasonable. I don't think that Derek Chauvin is a deranged white supremacist psychopath killer who's going to come out and kill the first black guy he sees. I don't think he had the intent to kill George Floyd, but as you said, he acted with reckless endangerment, so he deserves to, pay for that crime. But I don't think that, far into the future, he would necessarily be a danger to society.
Yeah, under Minnesota sentencing guidelines, for a person with no criminal history, each murder charge carries a presumptive sentence of about 12 and a half years, while a manslaughter conviction is 4 years. Now, each count carries a different maximum, and it can go up as high as 40. So, people are saying, he should get the rest of life in prison. Some people I've seen commentators have been saying that he needs to be buried beneath the prison, have the key thrown away. Obviously, this is not the way that you should want it to go if you're talking about manslaughter, where it's an accidental murder, because what you hold him to is what you're going to be held to yourself, not when you kneel down and suffocate someone to death, but when you accidentally harm somebody in your own life. This happens to stuff all the time.
And the question also is, what is the point of incarceration? We've looked at incarceration for a long time just as punishing people, just retribution. It really should be, at least in part, about rehabilitation. And with the exception of deranged killers and dangerous people, we shouldn't be locking people away and throwing away the key for the rest of their life.
You don't rehabilitate a police officer who recklessly killed somebody. You are punishing them. That's what this is for.
But you don't rehabilitate them into the police force, right? But they should be, at some point, for a manslaughter charge, that person should be able to come back into society. They shouldn't have to be behind bars for the rest of their life because they made one horrible mistake. I think that would be excessive in this situation. But you got to have a serious sentence. You can't have a slap on the wrist, 3 years in minimal security. Or then it really is an outrage.
Yeah, sentencing disparity is one of those things that has just sort of radicalized me on criminal justice reform. Just none of it makes sense. It's mandatory minimum sentences for drug crimes, right? Where if you just pair possession and dealing of drugs with a firearm, you could find yourself doing 50 to 60 years, but without the firearm, it's just a couple. It doesn't make any sense. And that's nice because you get an actual ledger where it's this crime equals this many years. But we also want judge discretion. We want judges to be as lenient as possible when they can, and to read the room and read the person that's actually getting sentenced and come up with something customized for that person. Neither one make people happy, because that's how you get instances where one pedophile, right, who harms a child is going to get 60 years. There was this case in Montana. A guy had admitted to raping his 12-year-old daughter. Oh, he got 60 days. 60 days in prison. This other guy in Delaware, 64 years old, he got a 125-year sentence for numerous counts of sexual abuse and rape of also same age, a 12-year-old girl who he was helping in his care. That doesn't make sense, and it just sort of goes to the whole question of the justice system is entirely subjective, and what people consider to be justice, it's just on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, and the subjectivity also, and I'm curious what you think of this, Olivia, but statistically it does lead to discrepancies. Black people and white people, in the same crime, same evidence, same conviction, Black people will, in many cases, statistically get a longer sentence. So I think the way we do it, I don't have all the answers, but I just think the way we do it's broken.
For sure. And it's like, especially when I think of things such as drug possession, I mean, the rates of marijuana usage between black and white people is essentially the same across the board, but black people do tend to get higher sentences, and they do tend to be arrested at a higher rate for the same crimes. And I think what we have to do is look at the legislation. We should not be fighting this war on drugs. Nobody wins. The big pharmaceutical companies win. Sure, the private prisons win, but the people don't. So I think we've already seen from the crazy draconian tactics of the last year with all the COVID lockdowns that law enforcement tends to enforce whatever the mandates are. They will literally arrest you for attending church. Yeah. That's what we've seen. So we're not going to stop the issue by just increasing police training or making them do diversity awareness month or whatever. We need to change the legislation. Yeah. We need to end the war on drugs. We need to stop these, low level offenses being forced into prison.